I would like to welcome Mr. Robert Spencer to the podium, our guest speaker. If you could all give him a hand, please.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here. I understand that you watched some of Islam, What the West Needs to Know earlier this evening. Is that correct? And so I feel as if now standing before you that I've suddenly aged 15 years in 10 minutes. But that's the way it goes. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. It is a moment of some distraction for me, I have to confess, because my brother-in-law is ill. I was just talking with him earlier. He's having some psychological problems and he thinks he's a moth. And I was talking to him and I said, you really have to go to a doctor. And he said, I did. I went to a doctor today. And so I was thinking that we were out of the woods, and I said, that's great. What did he say? And he said, well, it was a dentist. And I said, you need a psychologist. You don't need a dentist. Why did you go to the dentist? And he said, his light was on. And the reality of the situation that we face tonight, my friends, is that my brother-in-law is the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the United States. In other words, people who believe in absolutely unreal things are in charge of the Western world today. You may remember Alice in Wonderland and the chess pieces that were alive, and there was the White Queen, and the White Queen told Alice, I can believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. And I think she's got nothing on Justin Trudeau and Barack Obama, who can believe 12, 15, or 20 impossible things before breakfast and several hundred more by dinner time. And the impossible things that they believe and the fantasies to which they have committed themselves would be laughable were it not for the fact that they are deforming our foreign and domestic policies in both Canada and the United States, and that similar fantasists are in charge in Great Britain, in France, in Germany, in Italy, all over the free world. And that this can only be a recipe for disaster if it is not turned around. Now specifically, the fantasies that they would have us believe, we're really all familiar with. We've heard them all many times before. One of the chief ones that we hear is that ISIS, the group that calls itself the Islamic State, is not Islamic and has nothing whatsoever to do with the religion of Islam. Have you ever heard that? Now, the reality is that ISIS, or ISIL as the President of the United States calls it, or the Islamic State as they call themselves, actually has everything to do with the religion of Islam. And this is not just a matter of looking into strange religious beliefs that we do not hold and have no particular interest in. This is a pressing matter of national security for Canada, for the United States, for Western Europe and Great Britain. Because it's very simple. It's an adage as old as warfare. You cannot defeat an enemy you do not understand. And we are in the position now, like my brother-in-law the Moth, of replacing reality with fantasy and making that fantasy into public policy. What we have is the Islamic State saying, we are doing what we are doing because of the religion of Islam. We are the quintessential embodiment of the religion of Islam. We believe fully and wholeheartedly in the Quran, the Islamic holy book, and in the teachings of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. And we are implementing them in our country that we have carved out of Iraq and Syria. It's a territory larger than Great Britain, with 8 million people in it. And they say that they are the only rightful government in that area, and indeed in the whole world. And that government is based wholly and entirely upon Islamic principles. And in response, Barack Obama, John Kerry, David Cameron, Justin Trudeau all say, no, you really don't have anything to do with Islam, and nothing that you're doing is Islamic at all. Now the reason why this dispute matters, as absurd as that is, that when the enemy tells you his ideology, we say, no, 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 you don't really believe that. But as absurd as that is, it becomes dangerous because it makes for misapprehensions of the problem that lead to the wrong solutions being applied. It's just like if you had a headache and you said, I will just take some aspirin and my headache will go away, and it actually turned out to be a brain tumor, the aspirin will not help. And if you continue to just take aspirin and say it's just a minor headache problem and it has nothing to do with anything more serious, then the brain tumor will kill you. We're in the same situation now. The longer we misapprehend this problem, and the longer we keep our heads in the sand about it and deny what it's really all about, then the more we will not be able to deal with it adequately or properly, and the more lethal it will grow. Case in point is the Muslim migrant problem. The migrants flooding into Canada and the United States, and all of us know that anybody who opposes this mass migration is a racist and a bigot and a hate monger and an Islamophobe. And everybody knows that such people have no place in polite society. This migrant issue is inextricably bound up with that of ISIS or the Islamic State in ways that most of the mainstream media never discusses when they are dismissing opposition to the mass migration as just racism and xenophobia. The fact is that the migrants are overwhelmingly Muslim, and those Muslims are coming to Europe and Canada and the United States after the Islamic State threatened in February 2015 to flood Europe with 500,000 refugees. They said they were going to do it, and a few months later the refugees started to come. And once again, public policy analysts in Canada, the United States, and Europe all said, well, this migration is a humanitarian crisis out of Syria and has nothing to do with the Islamic State threatening to send 500,000 refugees into Europe. Now, wait a minute. Where is the Islamic State? Well, it's in Syria, as well as in Iraq. And so to say that it has nothing to do with their threat in the first place is silly. Even worse, most of the migrants, as many as 80%, are not Syrian at all. Where's the war right now? Syria. So if you're a refugee from a war zone, you would have to be Syrian. If you're not Syrian, if you're Moroccan or Algerian or something else, and most of the migrants are not Syrian, then you have a very different agenda from the agenda that is stated as you're a refugee from a war zone. So what are they really coming for? Well, to answer that question, we have to look into the religion of Islam, because the religion of Islam is actually what is guiding and motivating a great deal of this. But that's the one thing, you see, that all our learned analysts and all our political leaders have taken off the table. It has nothing to do with Islam. So they can't tell what it has to do with. They pretend it's a humanitarian crisis, when there's amazing cognitive dissonance about that right away, you see. If they're not Syrians, if a great many of them are not Syrians, then what exact humanitarian crisis are they fleeing? So in order to understand what's going on, we have to go to the Quran. So if you'll open your Qurans to chapter 4. You didn't bring it? I never leave home without mine. Anyway, it's no problem. I did bring mine. So you go to chapter 4, verse 100. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It says, he who emigrates in the way of Allah will find in the earth enough room for refuge, plentiful resources, and he who goes forth from his house is a migrant in the way of Allah and his messenger, and whom death overtakes, his reward becomes incumbent upon Allah. Now, did you hear that? He who emigrates, if you leave your country and go to another country in the way of Allah. Now that means you're not just emigrating to get a better job. You're not emigrating so that you can climb up the economic ladder and send money back to your family at home. You are emigrating in the way of Allah means you are emigrating in order to bring Islam to the new land. This is in imitation of Muhammad himself, who was the first emigrant. As a matter of fact, the beginning of Islam, according to the Islamic calendar, is not when Muhammad became a prophet, not when Muhammad was born, when Muhammad died, or anything we might expect. It's when Muhammad emigrated, the Hijrah, from Mecca to Medina, when he moved from one city to another in Arabia in order to become for the first time not just a spiritual leader and a preacher, but a political and military leader as well. He was bringing Islam to the new land and making it into a political entity. And that's the beginning of Islam, according to the Islamic calendar. And so, he who emigrates in the way of Allah is bringing Islam to the new place that he's coming to. And if he dies in the new land, his reward becomes incumbent upon Allah. Now that's very important. That means Allah, the Supreme God, has to reward him. He has to. He can't change his mind about this. It's binding. It's in the Quran. Now this is very important because in the Islamic scheme of things, if you're coming from a Christian background, you're used to thinking, well, Jesus died for my sins, he rose from the dead, and opened up heaven for me. Whereas in the Islamic scheme of things, there is no Savior and no redemption. There is only the scales. The scales are explained in chapter 21, verse 47 of the Quran. We shall set up just scales on the day of resurrection, so that none will be wronged in the least. Even if it be the weight of a grain of a mustard seed, we shall suffice as reckoners. What's a grain of mustard seed? Your good deeds. The idea is, if your good deeds, they go on one scale, your bad deeds go on the other. If your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you go to paradise. If your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds, you go to hell. That's it. Now, if you think about this for a second, if you were a believing Muslim, that would drive you crazy. Because how many good deeds have you committed? Do you know? How many bad deeds have you committed? Do you know? Do you know if you've committed more good deeds than bad deeds? Are you sure? Do you know how much your good deeds weigh? Do you know how much your bad deeds weigh? There's no way to know this. And so you're in danger of going to hell. And you might be on the way, but you can't be sure. And see, the thing is, hell is very lavishly described in the Quran. That Allah will pour molten lead down your throat for all eternity. He will burn off your skin and then issue you a new skin so he can burn that one off. It's a terrible place. You want to stay away from it. But you can't be sure with these scales which way you're going to go. However, you can do a couple of things to remedy your situation and make sure you're going to be okay. And one of the main ones is you can emigrate in the way of Allah. And then his reward is incumbent. He has to reward you. If you leave your home to bring Islam to a new land. So the Islamic State said, we're going to flood Europe with 500,000 refugees. They were talking about a several-pronged plan. One was to overwhelm the welfare apparatus in the European socialist states and to make them collapse. And that's working great. That's on its way. But also, they wanted to emigrate, to send people who were emigrating in the way of Allah. The Quran says also to the Muslims, you are the best of people, you're the best nation on earth. That's chapter 3, verse 110. Because you enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. See, Allah tells the Muslims, you're the best nation on earth because you know what's right and wrong, and they don't. And so when you emigrate in the way of Allah, what you're doing is you're bringing the system of right and wrong that's in the Quran and in Islam to the new land. And so you're coming with a model for society that you consider to be superior to the model for society in the land you're coming to, and you're determined to replace the one with the other.